Adjusting your front mech.
Okay, next we're going to talk about adjusting the front gear mechanism. Now, I'm just going to take this cover off just to make it easier for you to see how I'm adjusting things. Now, the first thing that we're going to need to do is make sure the gear mechanism is at the right height in comparison to the cogs. Now, if I press down on that gear mechanism there, can you see we've got around about a 2 or 3 millimeter gap there between the top of the cog and the underside of the outer plate of the gear mechanism, and that's perfect. If you need to adjust that, on the other side on the clamp is a bolt which you would undo, and then you can move the gear mechanism up and down. If you do move it up, remember that the cable might be quite tight when you do that and will resist you doing it, so you might need to undo the cable to allow you to move the mechanism up. That's not a problem because we'll talk about adjusting that back in the right way in a second. To adjust the mech being straight against the chain rings. Now you would do the height and this adjustment at the same time. We've just broken it down so you could see both. So again, go to the spanner on the other side, because you can see here that the back of this gear mechanism is further away from this outer cog than the front, so we just want it to run parallel. Now I'm not worried whether it's touching or near, I just want to get it parallel at the moment, and then I'm going to adjust the rest of it in a second. So now the trick is not to undo the bolt too far, because if you do, the gear mechanism will drop, and obviously you'll need to go back and then readjust the height of the gear mechanism as well. Again, that's generally caused because the cable is tight, so if you feel that you want to undo the cable first, absolutely fine, there's no problem with doing that, and then obviously you can just reattach it in a second, and I'll show you how to do that. So the next, we need to adjust the set screws. Now the set screws are these two screws here, and they control how far the gear mechanism travels inwards and outwards on the chain rings. So we need to set it so that obviously it's not over shifting, but also it stops the chain from being dropped off of the inside or thrown off of the outside of the chain rings. So first things first, we need a Phillips head screwdriver, and we then need to make sure that the gear shifter is all the way forwards on these grip shifts, so it's in a position where the cable is at its slackest position, and hopefully you can see that. There's actually two parts to this cable. One is the loose end, and then this piece here you can see is actually quite loose. Now I'm going to leave that loose for a second because I want to adjust the gear mechanism. Now what I'll do is I'll pedal it and I'll put it into the biggest cog at the back. Once I've done that, I want to see if the chain is touching the inside of the gear mechanism here, which it is. Now generally the inside screw controls the inside of the gear mechanism, but you've also got an L and a H written on them. L for low gears, smallest ones, H for high gears, biggest ones. So the opposite way round to the rear cogs. So what I'll do here is I'll move this a lot so you can see the gear mechanism moving, and then I'll put it back to where it needs to be. So you can see that's moving that a long way, and then screw it back again. It's coming back. Now what I want to see is about a 1 millimeter gap between the chain and that front gear mechanism. Okay, so we're at about 1 millimeter there, so that's perfect. The next thing I'll do is check on the tension of the cable. Now with that one, it's quite close to being tight. It's probably not quite tight enough, so you can adjust this in two ways. You have an adjuster on the gear mechanism, which we'll show you later, or you can actually physically pull the cable through. Now there's two ways to do this. Now if you want the cable to be quite tight, which generally on this system I do quite like it to be tight, there's two ways you can do it. You can simply put the screwdriver away, is undo this bolt here, this little pinch bolt, and again I've got hold of this cable, but I'm not worried about whether I'm pulling it yet or not. I just want to loosen this and just stop this cable from flying around, and then I can pull that cable through. Now these are quite hard to actually get some tension on these, but obviously I've been doing this a lot, so I'm used to it, and I'm now pulling it downwards and round my finger to keep the tension on there. The other way you can do it, it's a little bit of a cheat, is if you screw this screw inwards so it moves the gear mechanism back across, okay, that will make the cable slack. What I can do then is undo this bolt. I can pull the cable through, but not too much. Don't go mad with it, just pull it so it's sort of tight. Do that back up again, and then turn that back where I want it to be, and then that cable's nice and tight. Now if you don't want to do that, as I say, there is an adjuster up at the gear mechanism which you can use to do this as well. Now once this is done, I'm just going to tuck this cable back through the top out of the way, just so it's so you can see what's going on. And the next thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to pedal it, and I'm going to change the gears. So I'm now going to pull the gear mechanism back towards me till it goes onto the middle. You can hear it rubbing there, but if I just move it back a little bit, then it will stop rubbing. And then I want to come up onto the big cog. Now do this slowly, because we haven't adjusted the set screw yet for how far that will travel over. Now remembering also, your bike will have a guard on it, and that will also help it to stop over shifting, but it's only plastic, so remember it's not designed to have any load on it. Now that's dropped up onto the outside, but I'm also now going to move the rear gear mechanism into the smallest cog at the back. And in the same way that we looked for a gap on the inside plate when we adjusted the bottom one, what I'm looking for is a gap on the outside plate on the top one, and this one's a little bit too much. So I'm now going to screw this down, and you screw it until you can feel it, and then actually you should feel it go quite stiff and it will stop, and then I'll just come back a tiny little bit as well. If you don't come back a little bit, it'll struggle to get up onto the big cog. Now I'm just going to check it, so I'm going to move back down onto the middle cog, and then I'm going to move it back onto the big cog. Now what I looked for there is here, you'll see it try and overshift very, very slightly, where it'll try and get over the cog. So I'm just going to go a quarter of a turn. Okay, and then that stopped that little tiny bit of overshift there. Now when you're changing gears on the rear and the front ones, you cannot change them under load. Okay, by that I mean you must be pedaling, but you can't be putting any pressure on the pedals when you're changing. If you do, then because the chain is under tension, it won't want to move across the cogs. It will carry on trying to go straight. At the moment, no pressure on the chain, brilliant. It's not going anywhere. As soon as you put any pressure on, that will become absolutely solid and it won't want to move. So when you are changing across those cogs, make sure that you're obviously backing off the pressure to let it change gear. Also, if you're going to change gears on the front, think about what gear you're in on the back. So if you are in the little cog and the little cog, and you try and change up, it'll probably be okay because the chain's actually coming from that direction. But on the front one, if it's on the big cog at the back, and you're trying to get it onto the big cog at the front, the chain's actually coming from close to the wheel, and it won't want to shift up onto that outside cog. So it's often better to change 2 gears down, and then the chain will change quite nicely across the front chain rings for you. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is just check that that's actually all working okay. So I'm just going to move there and then back down onto the bottom, and if you look, there's actually little scallops on here, so it's closer here than it is here to allow for the 3 cogs that you've got on there. So I want to go up onto the middle and drop it back a little bit, and then up onto the top, back down onto the middle, and back down onto the bottom just to check that it's all working okay. And we're all good.
For more hint and tips, visit cyclingtoolbox.com.